my presentation here.
Now you are the boss.
Sounds good. Okay. Let's see here.
Ok, pessoal, vou pedir para vocês desligarem os microfones para não ter interferência. Eu vou desligar o meu agora. And Scott, I will turn off my phone, okay? And now you are the boss. Go ahead. Good luck. We are very anxious about your presentation.
Awesome. Okay, and you guys can see it perfectly good?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not full screen.
Yeah, you don't need to put full screen.
Not too sure. Did that make it full screen or still no?
No.
Not yet.
Yeah, no problem. Take your time.
I believe that you have to start a whole presentation. Just don't start with just the PowerPoint presentation. Otherwise, we will not be able to put that on full screen. So,
Okay, just how do you want me to start it?
I think you should click on present now.
Okay, yeah.
And then you will have an option of full screen, one window, or one tab. You must go full screen, and then when you go full screen, you can go to your presentation and then click on start presentation or F5 if you're using Windows device.
Yeah, good. Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. Perfect. I can get started now. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here and to talk about creatine. I think it's the king of supplements. Obviously, other individuals might think other nutrients might be important, but I think from a supplement standpoint, so a supplement is something that you have to consume in addition to your diet. I think creatine has the best effects, and it's the king of supplements, not only to enhance performance, but also to enhance health as well. And so, yeah, I'm currently at Brandon University, but I'm also an adjunct as well at the University of Regina. So I had to pronounce that correctly for you guys. So today, what I'm going to talk about is just outline how creatine works within the body. And I'm going to provide some evidence of how creatine can impact not only muscle performance, but also bone health and brain health as well. And again, that's, I think, why creatine has been so important with regards to my academic career is because it seems to be a benefit in a variety of different tissues, not just in the muscle. So first, I just want to point out that creatine is not a steroid. So a lot of people think that creatine is bad for you, that it's a gateway drug, that it's going to destroy your kidneys, your liver. But it's actually one of the safest supplements that you can possibly consume. There's very few side effects, and if you have any side effects, they're usually quite minor. Things like gastrointestinal distress or nausea, but typically that's associated with a loading phase. So if you just take a lower amount of creatine, you can get rid of those side effects and you can still get a lot of the benefits. But what is creatine if it's not a steroid? Essentially, it's made up of these three amino acids: arginine, glycine, and methionine. It requires two enzymes, and you can put these three amino acids together and you can create what's known as creatine. And then creatine's broken down into creatinine. So that's a process that occurs daily. So we break down creatine within our body, it produces creatinine, and we excrete that. So you have to replace it either by these 3 amino acids, and then your liver and your kidneys can create creatine, or you can consume creatine in your diet, or you can consume it as a supplement. And so creatine was actually first identified in 1832 by this French philosopher, Michel Eugène Chevrel. So we've known about creatine for a long time. So I'm quite young. I'm much younger than this individual would be if he was still alive. So they've known about creatine even before Tasuda was born. They've known about creatine. So creatine is not a new supplement. It's been around for quite a long period of time. So once creatine is taken up into the bloodstream, about 95% of creatine is taken up by the muscle. And then other tissues might have creatine in it as well, things like your brain, bones, adipocytes. So other cells in your body have creatine as well. But 95% of creatine is taken up into the muscle. So once creatine is taken up into the muscle, 2/3 of creatine is converted into creatine phosphate. So that's what CP stands for here. And if you add that with adenosine diphosphate, you can create ATP. So anytime you perform a muscular contraction, you do exercise, or any energy requiring process within the cell, you can resynthesize ATP using this energy pathway. And the best thing about this pathway is it actually only uses one enzyme. So it's the fastest energy system that we have. We have other ways to produce ATP, but they're much slower. And so this is actually a rate, so how fast these energy systems are. And so on the left, you can see phosphocreatine, so that creatine energy system. And you can see it's the fastest energy system. Next, we have anaerobic glycolytic system. So you can break down sugar anaerobically, either glycogen or glucose. It's a great way to produce ATP, except for it's a little bit slower. And it also has a byproduct of increasing hydrogen ions as well. We could also break down sugar or glucose through our mitochondria, so oxidation. It's a bit slower of a process. And you can break down fat as a fuel source as well. You can also break down protein or amino acids, but typically during exercise, we try to avoid using our muscles as an energy source, and we prefer to use these other energy sources. So the phosphocreatine is the fastest one. The problem with the phosphocreatine system is it has a limited capacity. So it can only support really intense exercise for about 8 to 12 seconds, whereas some of the other energy systems can last much longer than that. So it's the fastest one, but it has the smallest capacity. So if you think of running, for example, the phosphocreatine energy system would be really useful for Usain Bolt to run 100 meters. The anaerobic glycolytic system would be a benefit for athletes trying to run 800 meters, for example, about a 2-minute race. Glycogen oxidation would be important for marathon running. And then if you just rely on fat as a fuel source, you'll probably be as fast as the turtle. So it's important to be able to, even for marathon running, it's important to be able to oxidize or burn glycogen to support that intensity or that speed of exercise. The creatine system, as I mentioned, is the fastest one, supports high intensity exercise. When you think about the types of exercise it could be a benefit to, kind of the first one that comes to mind is resistance training, where you do really intense exercise for short periods of time, and then you take a rest. Or if you're doing interval training, things like running upstairs, doing sprints, for example, taking a rest period and doing it again. So the creatine system can be great benefit for these types of exercise, at least in theory. So I previously mentioned that you can get creatine from different sources like supplements. You can also create it within your body, and you can also get creatine within food. And so as a sport nutritionist, I always think about trying to give advice to athletes, and I always want a food first approach. So how can we get creatine just by consuming foods? You can do it in a variety of different foods, but typically they're animal based. And so things like fish, so cod or herring, for example, or red meat, for example, like beef. You can also get it from milk, pork, salmon, shrimp, etc. And so most studies use or provide around 5 grams a day. So some studies use a little bit less than 5 grams a day. Some studies, and actually most of the studies that we've used, we use a little bit more than 5 grams a day. But most studies use around 5 grams a day. So if you want to get 5 grams a day of creatine from a food source, this is what you'd have to eat. If you wanted to do it with cod, you'd have to consume 3.5 pounds of cod per day. That's a huge amount. Probably not sustainable or realistic. If you want to do it with beef, you'd have to consume 3.33 pounds of beef a day to get 5 grams. Milk, all you need to do is consume about 200 cups of milk a day. Salmon, 2.5 pounds of salmon. So hopefully you realize that those are probably not realistic goals. And this is probably one of the only supplements that if you really want to optimize muscle performance and saturate your muscles with creatine, you probably need a supplement to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen so much benefits with regards to creatine supplementation, is because really to saturate your muscles with creatine and get the best that you can possibly get out of your muscles with regards to that energy system, you have to supplement with it. And so it's the king of supplements, and it's probably the only supplement that you actually need. Other supplements that have been shown to be a benefit, like caffeine, you can get from drinking coffee. Protein, for example, you can get from eating good protein sources, whether they're animal-based or plant-based. So you can get enough protein in your diet. You don't have to supplement. But creatine, it's actually very difficult to get enough creatine from food. So if you supplement with creatine, is that you can go from, if you're a vegetarian, you typically have lower values of creatine within your muscle. If you eat meat, you have slightly more creatine, but if you supplement with creatine and you load with creatine, you can increase the amount of creatine within your muscle. So almost everybody responds to creatine. There are individuals that don't respond as well or might just respond a little bit, but almost everyone responds to creatine supplementation. And so there's different ways to load your muscles with creatine. And so kind of the traditional way is you do that creatine loading phase. You take 20 grams per day, do that for 5 or 7 days, and then you drop down to a maintenance dose. We also know, and there's some early research to show this from Paul Greenhoff's lab, and the article is called Muscle Creatine Loading in Men, where they compared this kind of high overload dosing protocol to a low dose, where you just take 3 grams a day for 28 days. What they actually found was both of those strategies actually increased the muscle content, creatine content, to a similar level, and they increased it to about 20%. So you can get a robust increase in the amount of creatine within your muscle from either just taking 3 grams a day for 28 days or doing a loading phase taking 20 grams a day for 5 days, and then dropping down to a maintenance dose. And then this guy down here, who's quite bald, maybe associated with creatine, is Dr. Darren Kandow and one of my good collaborators. But we often use 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And our rationale is that a bigger person might just require a little bit more creatine. If they have more muscle and they're bigger, maybe give them a little bit more. And so we use a relative dosing strategy of 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram of body mass per day. And we've shown that this is very effective in a variety of populations, from younger individuals trying to get bigger, stronger muscles to aging populations as well. And then lastly, there's a couple studies out there that suggest that if you combine creatine with either a carbohydrate or a protein source, you can increase the creatine uptake into the muscle. And this is thought to be associated with an increase in insulin. So both carbohydrates and protein stimulate insulin, and that's going to help creatine be transported into the muscle. And so this is a paper that we actually just submitted. It's under review right now. And we tried to look at, does dosing and how you deliver creatine actually influence the outcomes? And what we did was we looked at all the studies that use 5 grams or less of creatine per day. And we looked at a variety of outcomes with things like lean tissue mass or lower body and upper body strength. So this figure here is actually associated with the lower body strength. But what we found was if you took a lower dose of creatine, and we put all these studies together here that use 5 grams or less, it wasn't actually significantly different between creatine or placebo. So a low dose of creatine didn't seem to enhance leg press strength in this situation in aging adults. But if we gave individuals a higher dose, so here's the high dose right here, then when you put all those studies together, it favors creatine, suggesting that creatine was effective if you gave a higher dose of creatine, which is greater than 5 grams a day. Then it enhanced leg press strength. I'm not showing you guys today, but for lean tissue mass, so building muscle mass, and upper body strength, it actually showed no difference between a low dose or a high dose. So maybe there's fiber type differences between upper body and lower body that maybe affected some of these outcomes, but it seems like for lower body strength, that's a main outcome that you want to achieve. And you're an older individual, perhaps taking more than 5 grams a day is more effective than 5 grams or less. And we also wanted to find out if you can just take creatine on training days. So this is another question that I get quite a bit. Do you have to take it every single day, or can you just take it on days that you train? And I said, there's a few studies out there, so let's put them together and see what we find. And so these are all the studies. There's 4 studies that have looked at creatine just on training days. And what we found was that it favors creatine. So again, if you take creatine just on training days, you can get bigger muscles, and you can also improve upper body strength and lower body strength as well. So another strategy that people can try if they don't want to take creatine every single day is just take it on training days, and it seems to be effective. So how does creatine actually influence muscle? This was my master's supervisor, and I know he was involved with Coach Boyko's academic career as well. So this is Phil Chillibeck, and he's one of the best researchers in the world with regards to creatine and aging adults, particularly combining creatine with exercise. He was one of the first to do that in an aging population. And he's written a review in 2017 And he looked at all the mechanisms associated with how creatine can actually influence muscle growth. And so we know that creatine can influence the amount of phosphocreatine in the muscle. It can give that energy system a little bit greater capacity, so then you can train a little bit harder. The other cool thing about creatine is that it also sucks in glucose or glycogen into the muscle. And again, that could be used as an energy source to create ATP. And you can increase exercise capacity and train a little bit more. So there are a few studies to suggest that if you take creatine, you could actually increase your training volume. We also know that creatine can influence reactive oxygen species, so it could decrease oxidative stress. And there's a few studies to support that. We also know that creatine can influence IGF-1, and that's an anabolic hormone. We also know that creatine can influence, it's called myogenic regulatory factors. And the study that really showed that was it was a Canadian researcher from McMaster University in Ontario, Mark Tarnopolsky, from his lab. And what they did was they gave creatine for 7 days, and they looked at all the increase in mRNA of specific genes and proteins that were associated with osmosensing. So we know that creatine increases the amount of water within the muscle, and they measured all the things that were affected because of that. And what they showed was an upregulation of these myogenic regulatory factors. They showed an increase in satellite cell proliferation and differentiation. So those can all be associated with increasing the capacity for the muscle to grow. So this is a pretty cool study from a mechanism standpoint to show some of the benefits of creatine. And a lot of those benefits were actually associated with increasing water retention, which is really interesting because a lot of people get upset when they think, oh, creatine just increases water, causes puffy muscles, and it has no effect. Well, this study here shows that increasing water within the cell causes the cell to swell, and that stimulates a cascade of events that actually causes muscle to grow. So this is what I like to tell people, is that water retention signals the muscle to grow. It's actually a good thing to get some water into your muscles, and creatine does that. And then lastly, creatine inhibits myostatin, and we know that myostatin is an inhibitor of muscle growth. So if you can get rid of myostatin, you can make bigger and stronger muscles. And so if you Google search myostatin deficiency, you're going to find pictures of these cows that pop up, and these cows are incredibly jacked. So you can see the effect that knocking out or completely removing myostatin would have. Creatine doesn't do that completely, but it downregulates myostatin. So creatine does a lot of things within the muscle beyond just increasing that phosphocreatine energy system. So in 2007 or 2008, I guess is when we got it published. This was a research article that I wrote with Darren Kandow and Phil Childan in Saskatchewan. And we gave creatine for 10 days, and we wanted to just that can enhance their performance. And so we did a bench press test. They had to use 70% of their max, and they had to do 3 sets. And each one of those sets was interspersed by only 1 minute. So you did as many reps as you could with 70%, and then we counted those reps. They re-racked it. We started the clock at 1 minute, and then on the second set, do as many reps as you can again. Third set, as many reps as you can. And so you can see on the graph, obviously from set 1 to set 2, they're fatigued. Their number of reps that they can perform is way down. And set 3 was like a massive struggle. You can only do around 5 reps. But if you took creatine for 10 days, you could actually increase the number of reps that you can perform over those 3 sets. So you can do a little bit more work. And in theory, if you can train a little bit harder, you can push yourself and do a couple more reps. Perhaps over time you can get bigger and stronger muscles. And so we've shown that as well, and this is a relatively recent study that we did in younger individuals, but we had them train for 5 weeks with creatine and without creatine, and we showed that if they took creatine, they increased their total body strength. So that was just a combination of their lower body and upper body strength. We put it together, we called it total body strength, and creatine was effective. And creatine also improved their endurance as well, which was pretty cool. Both groups increased their total body endurance, but creatine increased to a greater extent. So creatine was effective, just as we have predicted, to enhance strength over time. And we also know that creatine can make your muscles bigger over time as well. And so this is a paper that's under review as well right now, where we looked at these different dosing strategies. And in this case, there was both the low dose and the high dose were effective at increasing lean tissue mass. And the overall effect was that creatine is a great benefit to enhance muscle mass when it combined with resistance training. So creatine does help you get bigger muscles. That's very well known now. Creatine could also be a benefit for older individuals that have clinical diseases such as sarcopenia or other diseases that might also affect the bones as well, things like osteoporosis. And so we recently published a review looking at osteoporosis, sarcopenia, and the impact of resistance and creatine in that population. And so, again, creatine appears like it could be a great benefit. There's actually very few studies that have actually shown in individuals that have been diagnosed with sarcopenia a benefit of creatine. So I encourage researchers to do more in that area for sure. We also know that creatine can influence sit to stand as well. So this was another review that we wrote in 2019. And we showed that if you took creatine, you can improve sit to stand performance. And we got pretty excited when we saw that result, because sit to stand is a surrogate marker for falls risk. So perhaps creatine can reduce your chances of falling. That still hasn't been shown. I think that's a very difficult study to run. It would require a huge population, a huge sample size. But we know that creatine can improve sit to stands. So this was, again, a pretty positive finding. And not only does creatine enhance strength, it enhances muscle mass, but it also enhances function in these older adults. So it could be a benefit for any aging individual. We've shown this repeatedly. Not every individual responds the same to creatine. As I mentioned previously, some people have a small response to creatine, some people have a greater response to creatine. So why is that? So we kind of dove into all the variables that can influence creatine supplementation. Again, in aging individuals, that was focused the paper, but I think it could be applied to other populations as well. And within this paper, there's one study that's really cool, and this was actually done by my PhD supervisor, Dr. Gordon Bell, and one of his collaborators, Dan Sirtak. And what they did was they supplemented individuals with creatine, and they looked at who responded and who didn't respond to creatine. And what they found was individuals that responded to creatine, they typically had lower creatine within their muscles. So, for example, we know vegetarians have lower amounts of creatine within their muscles. And we also know that they tend to respond better to creatine. We also think that older adults in certain muscle groups actually have lower levels of creatine within their muscles, and they might respond better to creatine supplementation. And then the other important finding that they found was that individuals who had more type 2 muscle fibers might actually respond better to creatine supplementation. So creatine might be, again, a better supplement for individuals that have more fast twitch fibers. So power lifters, bodybuilders, and it might be less effective for individuals that have more slow twitch fibers, like endurance athletes. But these were the two major findings. So these are the things that predicted whether somebody would respond to creatine or not. The amount of creatine within their muscle and their fiber type. Now, obviously, this is me here. I'm a responder to creatine supplementation. So does creatine timing matter? So this has been another question that I commonly get, and people want to know if you take creatine before training or after training or during training, does it actually make a difference? And my opinion on this has actually changed a little bit with some of the science that came out. We actually published a review in 2018 looking at all the studies that looked at creatine timing. And we actually showed that taking creatine after training was slightly better to augment resistance training adaptations compared to taking it before training. And so at that time, there's only 3 studies that were done, and one used older population, another one used a younger population that were bodybuilders. So it was hard to actually clump those studies together. We did it anyways, but does it actually influence things over time? We wanted to perform more research in this area. And so the reason why we really got interested in this topic actually started back in 2006. And this study here used the creatine containing supplement. So it contained other things as well, but it was pretty cool. So what they did was they gave the supplement 5 hours before they trained and 5 hours after. So they weren't allowed to take the supplement close to their training session. There was another group that creatine or this creatine containing supplement just before and just after their training. And what they found was that the group that got it close to their training session, so the pre-post group, they actually got bigger muscles over time, and their percent body fat significantly decreased compared to the group that got the supplement 5 hours before and 5 hours after. So we're like, okay, taking it close to your training is probably important, but is taking it before or after actually better? And so, as I've previously mentioned, there's 3 studies that looked at creatine before versus after. After was slightly better. But a problem with those 3 studies is they used what's known as a between subject design. And so, for example, that would mean if I was a participant, I'd get randomized to either creatine before or creatine after. So let's say I got creatine after, and for 8 weeks, I measure how big and strong my muscles get over that 8 weeks. Another participant, let's say it's Coach Boyko. He enrolls in the study. He gets randomized to either creatine before or creatine after. Let's say he gets creatine before, so in the other group than I am. He trains for 8 weeks. We measure how big and strong his muscles get. And so at the end of the day, it showed that taking creatine after had a slight advantage compared to taking creatine before. The problem is we have different genetics. We eat different amounts of protein. We sleep different amounts, and all those things potentially can influence muscle growth and strength adaptations. So what I wanted to do is a better design that I thought of was a within subject design. So this is where I had participants train the right side of their body one day and the left side of their body another day. They trained the right side twice a week and the left side of their body twice a week. One side of their body got creatine before training, another side of their body got creatine after training. And so this design helps to control for genetics. It helps to control for protein intake or our habitual dietary intake, all those things that could potentially influence muscle growth. The only difference between the two sides were one was getting creatine before training and one was getting creatine after training. So this is a very strong and powerful design. And what we found is, so we measured muscle thickness, so how big their muscles got. We also measured how strong their muscles got. We looked at elbow flexors, your biceps, which is the most important muscle in your body, and leg extension, so your quadricep strength and muscle thickness as well. We found no difference between taking creatine before training or creatine after training, both for muscle changes and for strength changes. So it didn't matter. So using this really strong, powerful design to try to tease out the effects of creatine timing made absolutely no difference. Study is, it's been accepted in the Journal of Sports Medicine and Physical Fitness. It was accepted about 6 months ago, so hopefully it comes out relatively soon. But at the end of the day, we actually show that creatine timing does not differentially impact resistance training adaptations. So at the end of the day, it actually doesn't matter if you take creatine before training or after. 2 years ago, I thought after was better, but right now, it doesn't matter. We've also shown that taking creatine during training is also an effective way to increase muscle mass and strength adaptation. So another question that we commonly get is, what if you're not resistance training? Is there any benefit to creatine? And this was a paper that I was honored to write with Coach Boyko and Tostito, and we got it published in the Journal of Dietary Supplements. And we looked at all the studies in older adults just taking creatine without exercise. And what we actually found was there was 11 studies that have examined creatine without exercise on muscle performance. And 7 of those 11 studies actually found some improvements with regards to muscle performance. When we look at those studies a little closer, it seems like loading might be required, but I think more studies need to be done to really figure out how we can maximize some of the benefits of creatine without exercise. I'm not suggesting that people try that. I always suggest that people do exercise. It's really important for you. But if you're not going to exercise, creatine might still have a benefit. What about bone? So let's switch from muscle to bone. There's actually some pretty cool research in this area as well. There's less research with regards to creatine and bone, but there's definitely a few studies that are emerging recently. And so creatine can actually impact bone in 2 different ways. One, an indirect way. So I've already mentioned that if you take creatine and you exercise, you can get bigger and stronger muscles. Well, those muscles, they pull on bones and they stress the bone, and over time you can actually get perhaps greater bone accretion or bone growth. The other way is through a direct effect. And so what they've actually, so there's these cells that are important for bone formation. They're called osteoblasts. And so what they did is they had a cell culture, osteoblasts. They put some creatine in there, and it increased the activity of those osteoblasts. So that's pretty exciting as well, because it could actually help these osteoblasts increase their activity and make bone that way as well. So there's 2 mechanisms where creatine can actually impact bone, an indirect and a direct. And so we wrote a review on this as well. And what we actually found was overall there was no effect of creatine when combined with resistance training on bone. But when we look at those studies a little bit closer, what we found was that the studies that were at least 9 months in duration were more effective. And they also had to train at least 3 times a week. So if you just took creatine and didn't train, or if you just took creatine for a short period of time, less than 9 months, you're not going to get any meaningful effect with regards to bone adaptations. And so we know bone adapts a lot slower, has a lot slower turnover than muscle does. So it just takes a lot longer. And the best published study to date is that it was published in MSSE, so the Medicine, Science, and Sport and Exercise. And it was done by my colleagues, Phil Chilbeck and Darren Kandow. They trained for 12 months in postmenopausal women, and they trained 3 times a week. And what they found was if you took creatine, that they had less of a decrease in, so a less percent change for bone mineral density decrease compared to the placebo. So as these individuals age, you tend to see a decrease in their bone mineral density, but creatine attenuated that. So there was essentially no decrease over time. So that's pretty cool. And this was the longest study where they combined it with exercise, but they're actually just finishing up a 2-year study. So hopefully Darren and Phil get to work and get those results published shortly. Creatine can also impact brain health as well. And my go-to article is by Eric Rawson. And so it's Beyond Muscle, the effects of creatine supplementation on brain, creatine, cognitive processing, and traumatic brain injury. So anyone interested in this area, I would always send them to this article. But they've actually recently updated that article, and it's published in Nutrients, which is an open access journal. So you can just Google search this title and look at this article as well. So there's been a few new studies that were added to it, but very similar to that, the previous review article that I was suggesting, but this is the most recent one. And so creatine could be a benefit to the brain. So the brain has a high demand for energy. So about 20% of your total energy expenditure, despite just accounting for 2% of the body weight. And creatine supplementation can increase brain creatine levels. So if you take creatine, you can increase the amount of creatine within the brain. So in the muscle, it's about a 20% increase, and it's quite robust. In the brain, it's about a 10% increase, and it's highly variable. So it's not everyone responds to creatine the same way that they do at the muscle level. And some people actually might go down. So there's actually been a variety of different studies. And if you look at total creatine content, so if you supplement with creatine, the range is increasing total creatine from 3.1% to 14.6%. From phosphocreatine, some studies actually showed a decrease. So they supplemented their participants with creatine. They measured the amount of phosphocreatine within the brain, and it actually went down. So you can see that there's a lot of variability. It's not as consistent, and it's definitely not as robust as what happens at the muscle level. But there does seem to be some pretty cool research with regards to some of the benefits of creatine on brain health. So this was a study, it was done in rats. Essentially, it showed that if these rats supplemented with creatine for 4 weeks, they can improve learning, memory, and also mitochondrial function within the brain. So that was some pretty cool research, and again, showing some of the benefits of getting more creatine within the brain. But rats are not humans, so what about humans? So these are the studies in healthy individuals, and measuring a variety of different cognitive domains. So things like memory, processing speed, executive function, intelligence, and attention. And you can see that for some domains, it seems like there's some benefit, and sometimes it's mixed. Intelligence, it seems to enhance that, and it also seems to improve attention as well. And so there seems to be some benefits. The other thing I want you to know from this particular slide is that there is no detriment to brain function when you take creatine. Either it has no effect or a positive effect. So again, there's no risk to taking creatine from a brain health perspective. And then there's actually been some pretty cool research to show that if you take creatine and stress the brain, you can actually see better results from creatine supplementation. And so there's a variety of ways to stress the brain. One, you can be sleep deprived. So we know adults need 7 to 9 hours a night of sleep, but not everyone gets that. So you're in a sleep deprived state. Hypoxia, so a low amount of oxygen. It's another way to stress the brain. Concussions or traumatic brain injuries, or mental fatigue. So these are a few ways that scientists have tried to stress the brain. And when they do that, they tend to show better effects with regards to creatine supplementation. So this is one where they did oxygen deprivation or hypoxia. And what they found was if you are oxygen deprived, so your brain's not getting enough oxygen, these are the white bars right here, your cognition goes down. So here's a bunch of things that they measured: complex attention, executive function, cognitive flexibility, etc. And so if you got less oxygen to your brain, your cognition went down. But if you supplement it with creatine, it barely went down or it didn't go down at all. And so creatine attenuated that decrease in cognition typically associated with hypoxia. So this is a study looking at creatine and deprivation. Again, when you're sleep deprived, your cognition goes down. But if you took creatine, it didn't go down. So that's pretty cool and showing some of the powers of creatine on brain function. So if you know anyone that's sleep deprived and maybe going up altitude, creatine could be really effective. This was a study looking at mental fatigue. So they had to do a mentally challenging task, and they measured their executive function with a Stroop test, and they also did a visual performance skill as well. But what they found was if you took creatine, your Stroop score was improved. So that's a marker of executive function. So again, some benefits of creatine if you're mentally fatigued. This was an athletic study where they looked at passing accuracy of a group of rugby players. And these rugby players were also sleep deprived as well. And again, they showed benefits of creatine supplementation. So here's the data right here. So if they're sleep deprived, their passing accuracy went down. So here was when they got normal sleep. And here's when they got 3 to 5 hours of sleep the previous night. So their passing accuracy went down. But if they took creatine, either 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, then you don't see much difference even when they're sleep deprived. And if you take a higher dose of creatine, perhaps you can even increase their performance. And again, there's no difference between sleep deprived states or non-sleep deprived states. So there seems to be some benefits to creatine supplementation. And this is one of my favorite studies here by Andre and my great friends from Brazil, where they looked at creatine combined with resistance training. So one of the few studies that has actually done this and looked at some marker of cognition. So they used MoCA, and they showed that if you took creatine and trained for 16 weeks, you can improve MoCA, which is just a overall cognitive function test. So that's some pretty cool findings that combining creatine with resistance training could have some benefits on cognitive function. So some future research, I think people need to do more research looking at mild traumatic brain injury. There's a couple really cool rat studies where they showed that creatine can actually be neuroprotective. And there's 2 studies I'm aware of in humans, both in children, where they've shown improved recovery following a traumatic brain injury. But we know that if you have a mild traumatic brain injury, your brain creatine content goes down. So perhaps it could be either protective to the brain, or it can help the brain recover faster. We also know in NFL football players that have had a lot of head impacts, their brain creatine content is lower. So again, maybe it could be a benefit for NFL players to consume some creatine. And then also Alzheimer's disease. they also have lower amounts of creatine within the brain. And again, maybe creatine could be a great supplement to improve their cognition, particularly maybe even prevent Alzheimer's. I don't know. I'm not going to go quite that far, but at least to improve their cognition or slow their cognitive decline over time. But future research in these areas is definitely warranted. I think one area where creatine can have a great impact, because creatine can make your muscles bigger, stronger, more powerful. It can also improve your cognition as well, and it can make your bones stronger. But that would be really important for combat sports like mixed martial arts. And I wrote a review on some of the practical strategies and considerations for creatine for mixed martial arts. And I think there could be some great benefit in this particular area. And I also collaborated with some Brazilian colleagues, and we showed that if you take creatine for 28 days, you can improve reaction time. And this is Muay Thai athletes, so another combat sport. And with some Iranian researchers, we actually showed that if you take creatine, you can improve their kicking performance in Taekwondo athletes. So we know that creatine can enhance kicking performance, your cognitive function, your reaction time. It could be great for athletes to consider creatine supplementation. So one study that I want to mention that we recently got published was combining creatine and caffeine. And so a lot of pre-workout supplements do this. And we thought that this would be great to look at and try to tease out some of the mechanisms. In this particular study, we just looked at muscle mass and muscle strength, but future studies will definitely have to look at some of the mechanisms. In this study here, we actually had multiple groups. So we had a caffeine-only group, a creatine-only group, a placebo control group, and a creatine caffeine group. And what we actually found was, for the most part, it actually didn't make any difference whether you took creatine and caffeine together or just creatine, except for one measure. So this was knee extensor muscle thickness. And so this is one that caught the attention of a lot of people, and a lot of people are now like, whoa, what do I do? But what we found was an improvement in knee extensor muscle thickness in the creatine group. So creatine worked, just like we've shown in a lot of other studies. But if you took creatine and caffeine, it didn't work the same degree as just creatine alone. So we're suggesting that maybe you shouldn't combine creatine and caffeine at the same time. And the mechanism for that is that creatine increases calcium uptake into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and caffeine releases calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So they have opposing effects. And there's some great work from Abby Smith-Ryan and Eric Trexler. They wrote a review trying to understand if creatine should be taken with caffeine. And they warned people essentially that maybe they have opposing effects and maybe they shouldn't be consumed together. And now we have some whole body evidence that, yeah, maybe don't take those things at the exact same time. So the good thing is, now we know that you can take creatine after training or before training or during training, it doesn't matter. So I suggest to people, if they want to consume caffeine, take it before training and then take creatine after training, and you'll have less interference effect. There we go. I got that animation there. So some key take-home points. So creatine is an effective supplement. There's no doubt about that, especially combining with resistance training. You can make your muscles stronger and bigger as well. And you can also improve function, like sit to stand. Creatine plus resistance training over sufficient duration and frequency can enhance bone strength. If you don't combine it with exercise, there's no effect. So you have to combine it with exercise. But and it takes at least 9 months, and you have to train at least 3 times a week. And then last but not least, creatine has potential to improve cognitive performance. And this is really an emerging area, and there's lots of interesting areas and future research that needs to be done in this particular field. Right? I also want to mention this is a recent paper that I was a co-authored on, where we talked about some of the common questions and misconceptions about creatine. So a lot of people think creatine is really bad for you, destroys your kidneys, females shouldn't take creatine, it's only important for bodybuilders, all these things associated with creatine. We looked at what does the science actually say. So this is an open access article, so you can just Google search the title and find it. And we show all the benefits of creatine and that it's an extremely safe supplement. So thank you very much for listening. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I post a lot of creatine studies on Instagram. So that's my handle there. So Scott_Forbes_PhD. And thanks for your attention.
So, fantastic presentation, my friend. Congratulations for you. And now we are open for questions. Who are the first?
I am the first. First of all, awesome presentation. I really think you have covered all the key points about creatine supplementation, but I wasn't expecting that, to be honest. Well, my first question, and the more obvious one, is which creatine reseller is supporting your work? Because, well, you know, it's an honest question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I've never actually received any money from a creatine supplement company. So people often accuse me and post on Instagram, and it's craziness, but I do it just for the science. So there's actually a recent article to suggest that creatine might cause cancer. It was done in a mouse model, and so I think there's some limitations associated with that. It'll be interesting to see what comes about from some of that research. So, you know, at the end of the day, if the data says that creatine is dangerous or bad, I don't think the data is there. And I think it's one of the safest supplements from my perspective. But obviously, if the data doesn't support creatine, then I would move on to another supplement. I'm not stuck on creatine, but I enjoy it right now because it is effective and it does appear to be safe.
Yeah, and I'm talking about the safetyness of the creatine. What are your thoughts about the creatine supplementation for people that have some kidney disease, like dialysis patients or something like that?
Yeah, so there's actually been a couple studies that have looked at individuals with kidney disease, and they've shown some benefits of creatine. That's not my area of expertise, but I've looked at those studies, I've read the studies, and they've actually, for example, muscle cramping is associated with dialysis, and they showed that individuals that were receiving dialysis, they gave them some creatine, and they actually had reduced symptoms of muscle cramping. So it shows some benefits of creatine even in those particular populations.
Awesome.
I think more studies need to be done, but obviously a lot of doctors are really concerned about creatine for kidney health or liver function, and they don't want to destroy the kidneys or liver, probably similar to a high protein diet. But we know that those are both really safe and perhaps could be effective.
Yeah, I'm asking that because I received some questions about the creatine supplementation and patients with kidney disease, and I was kind of confused. Like, we don't have like the support that it would be harmful, but sometimes we just don't want to risk that. But well, after that, probably it's something to consider, even if you have some kidney disease. I saw in the first meta-analysis that you presented, the comparison between the higher dose and the lower dose of creatine, what was the higher dose? Because the lower dose was 5 grams or less, and the higher dose was just 6 or more grams.
Yeah. So actually all the higher dose studies, they used a relative dosing strategy. And so I used the average body mass in that study and multiplied it by the relative dose. And most of the studies were around 8 grams. So perhaps taking a little bit more was effective, at least for lower body strength. So that was kind of interesting. So I don't know if it's maybe the relative dosing strategy that's actually the better strategy, or is it taking a little bit more? That's important.
Would promote those enhancements. Like it's the Darren method, right? When you go like 0.1 gram multiplied by the body weight. And it's perfect because you have a specific dose related to your body type. Because sometimes you can be overestimating or underestimating the creatine dose if you just place that, it's 5 grams. So yeah, it's really good to have those data to propose appropriated doses for specific populations. Besides that, I saw that you show a study from Gordon from 2004 where you tried to analyze the effectiveness of creatine in specific populations, and sometimes it didn't work. We have noticed in some caffeine research that we made that we have some non-responders because they are habitual consumers of caffeine. However, I think if the dose was higher than the usual, probably they would achieve like those enhancements in the performance. Do you think if we had like higher doses there, we would have better results?
Maybe,
yeah, it's a huge maybe because we saw that on caffeine. Like they are not just non-responders; they are just actual consumers. So they need a higher dose to have the effectiveness of that supplement. So perhaps if they experiment like a higher dose, the effect would be better.
Yeah,
so, I'm speculating that.
So,
I'm
Scotty.
not too sure. So, yeah, that's a great question.
Scotty, we have some guests here. Regina, she wants to ask something. And now we have Rebecca from Dr. Lancha's research group. And now we hear Dr. Lancha here with us. And so, Regina, please ask your question. After that, Rebecca, if you have some questions to Scott, please. And my friend Lancha, please ask your question. But Regina, please.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Scott, for your great presentation. I had 2 questions actually, because Luis Henrique asked about kidney disease. I guess the work that you mentioned is about people that are having dialysis, right? The ones that need protein supplementation. Is that right?
Yeah, so that there was one study in where they showed reduced symptoms of muscle cramping in individuals that were receiving dialysis.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Well, one question that I have here is that I was wondering, when we talk about supplementation, usually the ones that have the best response are the ones deficient, right? So you mentioned a lot of different works, and in some of them you mentioned that the benefits were not that great in the strength, the arm strength, I guess, right? So I was wondering if you control the amount of protein intake in this research, what is the average of protein intake from diet?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. And well, we know from Stu Phillips' work to optimize muscle mass and muscle gains, you need 1.6 grams per kilogram per day of protein.
Right.
So most of the studies that we run, the individuals are getting around 1.2 to 1.6 in the older individuals.
Right. So
and so they're getting enough protein or close to it.
right, that we would be 1.6 plus the supplementation.
Yeah.
Right. Perhaps that's why they wouldn't have that huge response that you were expecting.
Yeah, that's true. There has been some research where they've given creatine and protein after training, and they've shown that if you combine those two supplements, you could actually get bigger and stronger muscles. That was some work by Dr. Darren Burke. So yeah, I think that's a great question, and I want to review that area and write a manuscript on combining creatine and protein.
Right.
And is that the most effective, or maybe rerun the meta-analysis and look at studies that have lower amount of protein and see if it's more effective.
Yeah, I'm asking that because usually I don't see the athletes very controlling the protein intake from diet. Usually they have a lot of protein sources, and they take supplements, but they don't really look at the food intake carefully. So perhaps that's why the responses are so different.
Yeah,
I guess.
it could be for sure. So
It's something really hard to control that, especially in like 8 weeks, 10 weeks studies, because you would have to control everything that they eat, like for the whole study period. So it would be a problem. But yeah, it would be awesome if we could control the food intake.
Yeah, that would be the best scenario.
Yeah.
most studies, they'll just do a dietary record at the start of the study and at the end. So there is some information out there, but yeah, it's not perfect for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Rebecca, do you have any question? No questions. Wow. Rebecca for president, creatine for free for us. So, my friend Lansha, please. Are you here? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, come on.
I was trying to work with this mobile. Thanks, Scott, so much to have you here with us. Thank you, Tassi, to invite us to be together. It's a great pleasure for us, for our team. It's a very, very good pleasure. I was wondering about how do you think we can work with creatine supplementation, especially on pregnancy, in order to prevent the ischemia that usually happens, especially here in Brazil, and to prevent this ischemia from the babies. What's your view about this one, and what's your idea about this one?
Yeah, so that's not my area of expertise, but there's definitely some research in that area that has been showing some benefits. So I recommend that you go and read the literature, and I guarantee you'll find some studies that show a benefit of creatine to prevent ischemia in babies.
Yeah.
Well, we will do this one, and then we invite you to be together with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We will be together next month in June 19th. And Annie, yeah. And Lansha will talk about caffeine, and Scotty will talk about creatine, and I will talk about beta-alanine. Yeah. It will be a great event.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Talking about beta-alanine, Scott, do you have any perspective about the combination of creatine supplementation and another buffering supplements like beta-alanine or sodium bicarbonate?
Yeah, so we did that one study and just looking at Taekwondo performance. And we showed that both supplements, creatine and sodium bicarbonate, were effective. But if you combine them together, it had an even greater effect. So yes, so combining creatine with other supplements like beta-alanine would be a really interesting study to run.
Yeah, because it's interesting because when we talk about buffering supplements, we always think about beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate, but creatine have like a huge buffering capacity that people just choose to ignore. So the combination might be a very good thing.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I think the best combination with creatine and beta-alanine will be in older people.
But especially the creatine, the pKa of creatine is not so good as the beta-alanine to work as a nicely buffer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely say that beta-alanine is a stronger buffer than creatine is, but creatine also functions as a buffer. And as I mentioned, yeah, we've combined it with sodium bicarbonate and have shown some positive performance benefits.
The synergy might be interesting to verify, especially because we have another energy sources like the PCR acting that will not generate so much H plus hydrogen. So maybe I'm just speculating that as well because I'm trying to understand more the effect of the creatine maybe combined with another buffers.
Yeah, of course I will speak Latin. This is science, my friend. This is science.
Yeah, totally.
So, anyone?
I have one more.
Okay,
If you don't mind.
nice.
Okay, I'm always thinking about food, right? Because I'm a nutritionist. So I was looking at that table that you put there, Scott. And the herrings, the sardines, the amount of sardines that one would have to eat would be close to half a kilo a day, right? So I wonder if you could think about put some sardines, which is a very cheap source of protein, together with creatine and try to mix food and supplementation to see if they would respond. I'm talking about the cost actually, because most of people, especially here in Brazil, they can't afford to have those supplementation. So I wonder if we could try to mix food and supplementation, and I guess it would be an interesting research.
Yeah, I totally agree. No one's actually tried to increase the amount of creatine within somebody's muscle with a food source. No one I know of has ever looked at that. So that's a really good.
Of course, half a kilo of sardines would be too much, but let's say 200 grams a day from a source of protein specifically calculated, plus a little bit less of creatine, perhaps would be a good idea.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I was to give 5 grams of creatine per day, but I'm not totally convinced that 5 grams is absolutely necessary. I think you can take 3 grams or maybe even 2 grams of creatine and still get some benefits from that. So yeah, maybe you don't have to consume a half a kilo of sardines or 2.5 pounds of salmon or whatever it is.
Right.
Maybe you can get creatine from food sources and it can have a benefit.
Right. It's a good source of calcium, so sardines are pretty good in omega-3, and perhaps would be an interesting approach. Not by itself, but with supplementation together.
I was discussing about the Brazilian dietary habits another day, and we kind of noticed that might have some really big problems related to the creatine amount coming from the food sources, because the red meat just become really expensive here. We are not like fish eaters like in other countries, so we are basically eating more chicken and pork, and we don't have so much creatine on those foods. So probably in a few years we're gonna have some big problems related to the lack of creatine coming from the food sources.
Yeah, we should measure those changes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's gonna be something. I'm pretty sure of that.
Anyone?
Just, do you remember that Zuka's work with the dry fish?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And probably one good solution for this point of Regina
Uh-huh.
is to give dry fish in order to reduce the total volume and also to reach the total amount of creatine. Probably is a strategy to get a cheap creatine beside of protein as well as calcium.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
That would be really interesting and viable because it's cheaper.
Yeah. Zucas was my advisor in my master degree in Lancia too. Sergio Miguel Zucas was a great biochemistry researcher, was a great man, but he died some years ago. And anyone?
And when we think, I was thinking about the creatine and the caffeine study that you presented. Apparently, it don't work well together. But considering the potentials of the caffeine supplementation, do you know any other study that I'm to analyze the combination of creatine and the caffeine and saw some good results?
Yeah, so there's actually been a handful of studies that are short duration, but this was the first study where we actually train people for 5 weeks. So it's the first training study, but there's been some short-term performance studies, and it seems like if you load with creatine and then you just take caffeine, you can actually get some benefits from that. But if you load creatine and caffeine at the same time for that duration, then it seems like maybe they counter each other.
Yeah, the calcium release and uptake would be kind of mixed, right?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Like, it's the timing. It would influence the results.
I think so, yeah. So that's why I suggest maybe taking caffeine before and creatine after.
And Lancia, what do you think about this topic?
I agree with Scott that if you give like creatine for load, to increase the creatine, phosphoryl creatine amount, and after that you give the caffeine in a short time, you have a very good result. But the combination of chronically supplementation, they can compete for the calcium, the reticulum, then you have a kind of mixed results.
Yeah, sure. Okay, people, anyone? Maybe Scotty is exhausted right now. Hey, Scotty, you need to take your creatine right now. So, okay, people, open your cameras, please. Let's take a fantastic picture. Open your camera. Rebecca. Hi, Lancia, my big friend. Yeah. Pamela. So, wow. Where is my? Where is?
He lost his print screen. It's
Yeah. Hey, my friend. Just a moment. Oh, yeah. Okay. Cheers. Hey, Lancia, where are you?
Oh, I'll make a picture.
Come on. Yeah. Good. Okay, Scotty, was a big pleasure to have you here, my friend. Was a fantastic presentation. Many thanks for you. And this is not the last.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, my friend. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks so much, Tassi, too. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was awesome.
Okay. So,
Okay, we'll see you later.
I'll see you later, Scott.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Bom, pessoal, então foi isso aí. Tivemos uma ótima aula aqui com o Scott Forbes. Eu acho que todos os tópicos foram respondidos, né? E principalmente as questões de nós não precisamos suplementar a creatina antes, durante ou depois, tanto faz, né? Esse acho que foi o tópico principal. E essas recentes evidências com respeito à cafeína, né? Que se você consumir as duas em dosagens elevadas, pode ser que haja alguma intervenção uma com a outra, mas se você tomar em tempos diferentes, não tem problema nenhum. Tá? Espero que vocês tenham aproveitado, porque não é sempre que a gente tem a oportunidade de ter uma palestra com um pesquisador estrangeiro, né, do porte do Scott. Vocês viram que ele tem bastante paper, né? Inclusive a gente tem ali só que ele colocou a minha foto antiga, né? Devia ter colocado uma foto mais atual, né? Mas o Scott é um grande colaborador, ele e o Darren Condon, e a gente tem aí muitos projetos futuros em andamento, e principalmente com essa combinação com beta-alanina e creatina que eu estou projetando, mas não tem nada a ver com massa muscular, com nada disso, né? O que a gente quer ver agora é a parte cognitiva, principalmente nos pacientes com demência, e esse vai ser o nosso próximo projeto. Beleza? Então, obrigado a todos pela presença e vamos nos falando.
Obrigada, professor, pelo convite.
Show.
Foi uma honra adquirir essa aula, né? Foi muito boa mesmo.
É isso aí.
Professor, pela oportunidade.
Então é isso aí, beleza. Nos falamos em breve. Bye, bye.
Até mais.
Aí, rapaziada, espero que vocês tenham gostado, né? O Scott é sempre solícito. Vocês podem reparar que todas as lives que eu faço, a live do whisky, a live do suco de manhã, de tarde, o Scott sempre aparece, né? Sempre faz uma brincadeira. Eu acho que o Scott ele tem algum parente aqui, ou ele é um brasileiro enrustido, porque ele tem um comportamento bem alegre, bem diferente, né, de outros gringos que a gente conhece, que são mais sisudos. O Scott é gente boa. E é isso aí, né? Espero que vocês tenham gostado dessa live. É um presente aqui do General T para vocês todos que me seguem. E aproveitando, se vocês ainda não se inscreveram no meu canal do YouTube, corram lá, que hoje nós estreamos um programa, tem uma aula lá que eu fiz especialmente para vocês sobre a evolução do treinamento esportivo no planeta. A gente busca lá evidências de 3.000 anos antes de Cristo e a gente vem até os dias atuais. A aula tem a duração de 1 hora mais ou menos, mas é bem interessante, bem bacana. Tem alguns bastidores que eu conto sobre alguns professores russos que eu convivi, e espero que vocês tenham aproveitado essa live com o Scott. E vão lá, se inscrevam no meu canal do YouTube, deem seu like e deixem suas sugestões também para os próximos programas, tá? Regina, tô te vendo aí, obrigado você, né, por ter interagido, foi bem interessante suas perguntas, e é isso aí, né? Vejo vocês mais tarde, quando eu for passear com o Suki, beleza? E vamos nos falando. Não se esqueçam de ir lá, se inscrever no meu canal, dar um likezinho lá e sugestões. Beleza? See you guys tonight. Dismissed.